first tool to mention here is the triple STX with shadow. That's an indicator designed to plot on the price bars themselves, and it offers 3 different methods of STX stop calculations. And in addition to that, you have a dash line, which is the shadow line. And you'll note that I've switched over to TradeStation at this point now. This is crude on a weekly chart. And by the way, the various points that I'll be making today is by no means exhaustive, and as is almost always the case with Ocean Tools, I'm sure that each of you will find completely new and different ways to utilize the tools that go far beyond the ways that I'll be discussing. In feedback that we get from a lot of you, that's always been the case, and I expect it to be true even more so with these new additions. Okay, so here's how the triple STX with shadow appears on the screen. Note that there are 3 different STXs displayed. In cyan, that is this one right here, we see the traditional STX. In Genesis, this is named STX-A, and in TradeStation it's called the STX main. Then there is a faster version of the STX, shown in orange, and is called STX-B in Genesis and STX Fast in TradeStation. It's been tweaked to provide a more quickly adaptive calculation to the STX, which, as we'll see in a few minutes here, can have some very useful advantages. And lastly, we see the slower STX, that is named STX-C in Genesis and STX Slow in TradeStation. This is shown as the dark blue line here on price. Its speed has been tuned down to add a slower STX calculation, which has some real benefits when used correctly, and we'll explore that in just a moment. And lastly, we can see the STX shadow as this dashed line running through prices and through the STXs as well. This is named Shadow 1 in Genesis and simply Shadow in TradeStation. And this plot can have some very short-term utility in several different ways, and that too will be explored within the context of discussion of other triple STX formations as we progress. Let's take a look at some of the messages now contained in this new indicator. Initially, we can see that due to the math and therefore the speed of the 3 STX variances, they generally move in relation to one another but at different velocities. This unique attribute, then, has some real benefits for us. First, we can see that as a market begins to develop into a trend mode, and let's come back to this early part of the trend right here, the STXs tend to fan out. That is, they separate from one another. Here they had been very tight, and then they start to separate from one another as the trend progresses first to the upside, and then a sharp reversal occurs, and to the downside. Because they fan out, we usually refer to this formation as the fan. And this alone is quite helpful to the overall analysis of a market. That is, during the uptrend, in this phase through here, the fast STX will reside above the regular STX, the medium-term STX if you will, which in turn will then be positioned above the slowest of the 3 STX calculations. And of course, during a downtrend, these positions are simply reversed. As long as these STXs are positioned in this fan formation and prices remain above or below them, above in the case during the uptrend and below in the case of the downtrend, the trend should be considered to be intact. At times, the fastest STX may pull back to the medium speed STX, and I've marked a couple of these examples here, and we'll be discussing these formations shortly. But as long as these pullbacks of prices and or the fast or medium STX remain either bullishly or bearishly positioned relative to the slow STX, the trend is most likely to be considered remaining intact. We have to also remember that during the strongest of trends, the positions of prices themselves in relation to the STXs is important. That is, during the bullish phase, through here, prices will remain above all 3 BTXs, and conversely, as we transition from bull to bear phase in this particular chart example, prices will remain below the 3 BTXs as we move down. How prices relate then to these 3 BTXs during trends will be another subject that we'll analyze later, and we'll see that having the 3 BTX calculation to us adds 2 or 3 more additional benefits and methods of flexibility to the way that we can employ the STX stop technology. Another point to make concerning this fan formation associated with the triple STX is the shadow line. Again, that is the dash line here in TradeStation. Note that during a trend, the shadow line is the first to respond to a turn in prices. Here, 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 for instance. And will be positioned above the STXs in uptrends and below the STXs in downtrends. Generally speaking, the strongest bullish trends will create a situation where the shadow is positioned above the STXs and, importantly, above prices as well. And of course, this would be the opposite for a bearish trend. Then, looking at the position of the shadow in relation to the STXs creates yet another member of this fan formation as they, once again, all widen out from each other, first in this bullish phase here, and then in the bearish phase here. Note that as the trend loses some of its energy, the shadow line comes in contact with price bars very often, as was the case down here, having been above them during dominant portions of a trend, and we'll see other examples where we actually collide prices into the shadow line at tops as well. But here was a case, and this is not the best example of this particular formation, but it's a subtlety that I think you'll find quite valuable. And, of course, during the most dominant thrusting portion of the move, the STX will reside well above price action in bullish trends and well below them in bearish trends. And minor retracements, as was the case here and here, may force the shadow line back into contact with one or more of the STXs, which will then be the topic of another discussion a little bit later pertaining to what we call conjunctions. And it is important to note this situation pertaining to prices coming in contact with the shadow line, which was the case here as we were in the process of forming a significant low prior to the advance that took place here in crude oil throughout 2007 and into 2008. And as I say, there was a minor touch right here, but here's another example where prices came back in contact with the shadow as well. That, as we shall see, is a message that is a subtlety within the shadow line, but when taken in the context of what other Ocean Pro studies are telling us, has a lot of meaningful information to it. The other thing that we note here about the shadow line is this rapidity of the turn as a market is either beginning or ending reactions against a trend. Typically during a trend, say in this phase here, minor trend, in this phase here, fairly significant thrust to the upside, and of course in this one, significant thrust to the upside, and then all during the downward phase, the shadow line has a uniformity and consistency to it. But at turning locations, you'll notice that oftentimes the turn is of a degree greater than 90 degrees and can often be a sign that a market is running out of energy one way or the other. Here, of course, a significant turn back to the upside. Here was a very short-term turn to the downside, a significant turn to the upside, down again here, up again here, though a little hard to see, much more than a 90-degree angle at this point to the downside, and the same here down at this low. So that's another thing that appears a bit as a subtlety in the shadow analysis, but as we start looking at other tools, you'll find a tremendous amount of benefit to that. Okay, let's take just a little bit of time here and go through some chart examples and take a look at this fan formation. We've looked carefully at this process here where basically all of the STX were conjoined together and prices were trading back and forth through them, and until finally we got the breakout here where the fan began. That is the fast was positioned above the regular STX in cyan, which in turn was above the slow STX shown in this blue color. And that remained more or less the case all the way up. The fast and regular had some interplay here, but were still significantly above the slowest of the three combos. And that remained the case all the way up until the top, until we got the turn here where the fast crossed below the regular, and ultimately then through the fast. And as I mentioned a moment ago, the angularity of this turn in the shadow line was a single indicator predictor here. Again, we're only looking at the market through the lens of this one tool, but that was a predictor of the likelihood of probably a V-top occurring. And then the fan once again set itself up to the downside. So what we in effect have, that is throughout the bottom of this move here, and as the market then was transitioning from this bearish phase back to a bullish tone, basically we got once again the juxtaposition in such a way that the fast gets above the regular, which in turn is above the slow, and that simply remained the case up until this most recent top. Again, the kind of thing denoted potentially by what's happening with the shadow line. Having looked at the weekly chart, let's go over and take a look at a daily chart at some of the positions where, for instance, we get this fanning formation during trend moves. We see once again a very similar formation to what we had seen previously on this weekly chart of crude oil. That is a position where the three STXs are in effect on top of one another, and importantly flat, which is another thing that I think can help identify a congestion zone for you as well, though it's a bit nebulous and would be the kind of thing that would be picked up particularly by tools like the BTXs. However, once the move starts to the upside, we do get the fanning formation, that is fast above regular, which in turn is above slow. The market transitions into this phase here, which is just all considered congestion. And then once again, we rally up significantly with the fan moving its way forward as we would have hoped. That remains the case through this process here. Once again, we make the sharp angular turn. Prices are in a topping formation, and then you get a significant move of first the shadow line through the triple STX, and then the fastest to respond, the fast STX, cutting below, first in this case it's regular and then it's slow, and once again going into the fan formation, except for this brief interlude right here. But again, remember that we were always contained by what the slowest of the STXs was doing. As we move down, ultimately same situation all the way down into this bottom that was taking place in here. We get a brief pause back to the upside, the sharp turn, a pullback of this STX, and we're going to be discussing this process later. Then once again we get into the fanning formation. And as we can see, it's quite beneficial.